Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Greg Markey, and I'm the Assistant Dean and Global Head of the Center for the Executive Development at Mays Business School. On behalf of Mays Business School and the Center for Executive Development, I'd like to welcome all of you to our panel discussion this afternoon on diversity and inclusion. Diversity and inclusion are a company's mission, strategies, and practices to support a diverse workplace and leverage the effects of diversity to achieve a competitive business advantage. There are several reasons we need to explore diversity and inclusion in the workplace, but perhaps one of the most important reasons is to attract and retain high potential talent. The more that people, leaders, boards, managers, and organizations can learn to recognize and appreciate the differences across gender, race, ethnicity, mental and physical abilities, work styles, and lifestyles, the more inclusive they'll grow to be. They'll discover and unlock the potential of their talent in a way that moves the business forward and create an environment that makes their most talented people feel more engaged, energized, and ready to deliver on the next challenge. So before I introduce you to our moderator, let me share a few housekeeping instructions with you. During the last 20 to 25 minutes of today's event, we will dedicate it to questions and answers from you, our audience. We'll take those questions via the Q&A feature, which you should see at the bottom center of the Zoom screen. Feel free to ask questions during the conversation or during the last 20 minutes. When a question comes up, feel free to put it down there and we'll capture it to ask later on near the end. Please type and submit any questions in this box and we'll try to answer as many questions as possible. Now, without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to our panel moderator, Dean Eli Jones of the Mays Business School. Dr. Jones is a long-term friend and colleague of mine. He is a professor of marketing, Dean of Mays Business School, and Lowry and Peggy Mays Eminent Scholar at his alma mater, Texas A&M University. From 2012 to 2015, he was the Dean of the Sam M. Walton College of Business and the holder of the Sam M. Walton Leadership Chair at the University of Arkansas. From 2008 to 2012, he served as Dean of the E.J. Uso College of Business and the E.J. Uso Distinguished Professor of Business at Louisiana State University. Professor Jones started his academic career at the University of Houston and was on the faculty for 11 years. There he was assistant professor, associate professor with tenure, full professor, associate dean for executive education programs, and he is the founding executive director of the Sales Excellence Institute at the University of Houston. Dean Jones, I want to personally thank you for moderating this exciting and relevant panel for us, and I will turn it over to you now.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Greg. Howdy, everyone. We're so happy that you're able to join us. I will tell you how we got started with this topic was we had several of our business partners calling in saying, hey, given the current social unrest, I'd like to hear from you guys. What's really going on? Could you give us just a deeper understanding of what's going on in our country right now? I had members of our Dean's Advisory Board calling in, had members from the local community calling in. And so I met with the CED team and we decided to actually launch this webinar. And we have three fantastic panelists that I'll introduce in just a bit. But I just want you to know that that's how this whole topic started. And so the topic of the webinar is make the change, improve the situation. And our hope is by the end of this webinar, you will have uncovered some ideas and that you've actually thought carefully about diversity, equity, and inclusion. And then maybe you can make the change back in your organizations. We have on the line several CEOs. We have partners of Mays Business School on the line. We also have members of the Dean's Advisory Board of Mays. We have on the line our senior leadership team at Texas A&M. I'd like to welcome our provost, Dr. Carol Fierke, who's also on the line, and other dean colleagues here at A&M. We also have on the line my executive committee. These are department heads and associate deans. And we as a team have talked about this very topic. Just a few years ago, Mays launched a diversity and inclusion office, and I chose Dr. Annie McGowan to lead that effort. She's now an associate dean here at Mays, and we brought in Nancy Hutchins to lead the effort for our diversity and inclusion office. We just had a Mays Transformational Leaders Academy just about a week ago. We brought in underrepresented minority groups. They spent a week virtually talking about Texas A&M and becoming students at Texas A&M. So we have a lot of activities going on. We're really happy that you were able to join us today. When I think about our vision at Mays, it is to advance the world's prosperity. And we have a three-part mission. It is to increase our vibrant learning in our own organization. So we actually have topics that we discuss internally. We're constantly learning as well. We believe in lifelong learning, hence the Center for Executive Development. But we also know that we have to create impactful knowledge, and that's coming from the research side of what we work on. And we're developing transformational leaders. So that's our vision, that's our three-part mission. Today, I'd like to introduce you to our three panelists, and their bios are so long, I decided to read their bios. So let me start with Myrtle Jones. Myrtle Jones is at our partner company, Halliburton, and I understand Jeff Miller and his team are also listening in on this webinar. So we want to welcome Myrtle. Myrtle is Halliburton's Senior Vice President of Tax based in Houston, Texas. She is responsible for managing the company's global tax affairs in over 80 countries. In addition to her tax management responsibilities, she serves as the executive sponsor of Halliburton's African American Network Forum, an executive advisory board member of their Women's Sharing Excellence Affinity Group, and she chairs the Finance Department's Mentoring Committee. Prior to joining Halliburton, Ms. Jones served in the roles of Senior Managing Director of Tax and Internal Audit at Service Corporation International and Vice President of Tax at Global Santa Fe. She's a frequent public speaker on topics covering corporate income taxation and diversity in the workplace. She is the recipient of numerous awards, including Black Enterprise Magazine's 50 Most Powerful Women in Corporate America, the Diversity Council's Diversity Leader of the Year Award, Diversity Journal's Women Worth Watching Award, and Houston Business Journal's Top 25 Women in Oil and Gas. Please help me welcome Myrtle Jones. Hi, Myrtle.
Thank you for having me.
Glad you're here. I'd also like to introduce you to Dr. Christine Stanley. Dr. Christine Stanley is Professor of Higher Education in the Department of Educational Administration and Human Resource Development in the College of Education and Human Development at Texas A&M University. She is also Vice President and Associate Provost for Diversity Emerita. She has served the university in a variety of senior administrative roles as Vice President and Associate Provost for Diversity from 2009 to 2015, Acting Vice Provost for Academic Affairs from 2014 to 2015, Interim Associate Provost for Undergraduate Studies in 2011, Executive Associate Dean for Faculty Affairs in the College of Education and Human Development from 2006 to 2009, and Associate Dean of Faculties from 2003 to 2006. And Dr. Christine Stanley has also won many awards. Prior to joining the faculty at Texas A&M University, she was Associate Director of the Office of Faculty and TA Development at The Ohio State University, where she received the Distinguished Staff Award in 1999. She's edited 3 books, and she's published several papers, 50 at last count. She has done so much. She is also the recipient of several awards, including the 2015 Mildred Garcia Award for Exemplary Scholarship for Senior Practitioner Scholar from the Association for the Study of Higher Education. Please help me welcome Dr. Christine Stanley. Hi, Christine.
Hi, everyone. Nice to be here.
Glad you could be with us. And I also like to introduce you to Dr. Rick Rigsby. Dr. Rick is a very close friend. We've known each other for many, many years. We're happy to have him on board as well. He's the president and CEO of Rigsby Communications. The internationally acclaimed speaker presents to the top companies worldwide. Dr. Rick is also a favorite among professional and collegiate sports organizations. Rigsby, a former award-winning professor, spent over 2 decades teaching at various colleges, most of those years serving at Texas A&M University. In addition to academic duties, Dr. Rigsby was hired by legendary football icon R.C. Slocum as chaplain and life skills coach for the Aggies football team. A former award-winning journalist, Dr. Rigsby is a regular contributor on numerous national television and radio programs. I can tell you, if you Google him, just take a second and Google him. Look up his video, a graduation speech, and it's about his dad. And I love that about you, Rick. Lessons from a 3rd grade dropout. Over 300 million people globally. 300 million people have viewed that video. Welcome, Dr. Rick. Glad to have you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Jones. What a privilege to be with you folks today.
This is wonderful. We have a set of questions that we'd like to ask you to get started. And I want to tell you about how we arrived at the questions. You know, I think about how we get questions from our audience. And by the way, you have a chance to pose some questions. Many of you, as you registered, you submitted questions, and we hope to get to some of those. Internally, we also developed some questions based on our interactions with our business partners. And so I'm going to start with one that I think is going to be a really good place to start. Given all of your accomplishments, what challenges did you have to overcome to be where you are today? Let's start off with Myrtle.
Well, I can think of so many different things, and I thought about this question, but one thing stands out more than anything else, and that is I didn't know that I could have this job. I had no idea that there was even a place for me in corporate America. So I didn't really set out on my journey for education, for career, thinking one day I'd like to be a corporate executive at a Fortune 100 company. I set out first hoping that I would just get a really nice job that would allow me to rise above, the conditions that I was born in. I grew up in Mississippi during the era of Jim Crow. And it's impossible to dream of yourself sitting in a big corporate office if you're not even allowed to sit in a certain, waiting room because of the fact that you're Black. So I could talk about a lot of different things that were difficult on my journey, that were obstacles for me. But the hardest thing for me was to learn to dream and aspire to be in this position and free my own self of the limitations that I was placing on myself mentally from the fact that I just didn't think that this was a possibility.
Thank you. Thank you. Christine?
So I have a different experience than what I heard from Myrtle. I didn't grow up in the United States. In case you probably haven't noticed it, some of you may notice just a little bit, but I grew up in the Caribbean. I grew up in Jamaica, the West Indies, and came to the United States to go to college. And for me, growing up in rural Jamaica, education, it wasn't a question of education or higher education because my dad and my parents expected it for myself and my brother. It was an expectation. But coming to this country, one of the things, the challenges that I've had to overcome is, first of all, culture shock and experiencing xenophobia, racism, and also sexism as an immigrant and as a naturalized citizen particularly during my graduate school years. So both my father and I are Texas A&M graduates. My dad is class of 1984. In fact, did his PhD in poultry science of all things, if you can believe that. So that's my story. And I'll stop there. You may want to come back to that.
Yes, thank you. Rick?
I think probably the biggest hindrance that I had was me. I purposely and deliberately skated through my undergraduate years in the 70s before most of y'all were born, and then had a television career. So the whole focus in television is to offer the appearance, to construct reality. And in some ways that retarded my growth, but I was on TV, and according to my parents, I was off their payroll. And then I go back to graduate school, and I discovered that I had this love for learning. And so that barrier moves out of the way, and I just really begin to enjoy the whole process of learning. But then there were other barriers that served to be formidable. One was that when I was in graduate school in the 80s, I didn't see many people that looked like me. I didn't have many teachers that looked like me. So everything was Sesame Street. Everything was logical, everything was linear, and I'm not discounting those modes. They have their place. But I wasn't a logical, linear learner. I didn't function in a traditional kind of way. I literally had to teach myself by going outside the system how to exist. Let me give you a classic example real quick. For me to make it through 6 years of graduate school with, I have a attention deficit, as you know, Eli. We didn't have a name for it back when I was a kid. Your folk just said straighten up, you know. But at any rate, I would have to focus for 45 minutes and then have playtime for 15 minutes. And there was no book on that. There was no model about that. Everything was just straightforward, very logical, very institutionalized. And so that became a barrier that turned out to be a positive because it showed me that with determination and with the smarts that I have from God and my parents, I could overcome any obstacle.
Mm-hmm. No, that's right. So what I'm picking up here already is part of it is internal. It's not having exposure to role models per se, and the ability to kind of think past your own internal barriers, right? And to meet up with the right people who can transform your life. I think that's also part of it. No, that's good. We're going to dig in a little bit now, and as we've been looking at the news, and there are people who have talked about systemic issues. And so this question came to us: what is the historical and recent racial context for the current sentiment? And we want to look at it in several different ways. Let's start off with structurally. What are we seeing? Let's look at institutionally. What are we seeing? And you've already started down the path of interpersonally. What are we seeing? So how about Christine, would you start us out on this one?
Sure. Just looking back at what has been happening, as you said, Eli, nationally, and, quite honestly, it's been happening for a long time. And I think the death of George Floyd was sort of propelled us at that breaking point where things just kind of erupted, if you will. I think the United States has never really come to terms or reconciled or acknowledged, whatever word you want to use, the sin of slavery and racism. I think many of us still see it as a problem that happened in the past, and that I personally have nothing to do with that. And there are some, I think, who would even argue that structural and institutional racism does not exist. And the fact is, racism in higher education is steeped in historical legacies of exclusion. And in truth, when you look at college and universities and the histories of how college and universities were created, they were not created for faculty, students, and staff of color. So the issues have become systemic, deeply ingrained as normal everyday practice within our society and our organizations. And I think along with that, the silence that comes with denial and not addressing it or speaking up is at the heart of what we're seeing with the protests that are happening, and is at the very heart of the Black Lives Matter movement.
Thank you. Rick?
I completely agree with Christine. And somebody asked me, I was privileged to teach a lot of communication courses at Texas A&M, and my favorite course was the rhetoric of the civil rights movement. And I'll never forget, a student said, Dr. Rigsby, when did the Watts riots begin? And I said 1619. What I think is important is that we provide perspective for companies, that we provide perspective for great academic institutions like Texas A&M University. And in order to receive perspective, people have to be open. This isn't Black history. This is American history. We shouldn't celebrate Black History Month. We should celebrate the inclusion of all histories all throughout the year. Here's our history. Chiefs and kings and queens came over here, not slaves. Chiefs and tribal leaders came over here, representing the only group of people to unwillingly come to the United States. When we got here, we were bred to hate each other. We had the classifications of the house Negro and the field Negro. So here we are, considered 3/5 a human being, bred to hate each other in a country that we didn't volunteer to come from. What's the bottom line? I get so sick and tired of people saying, why are you playing the race card? We were never invited to the poker table to play any card. Here's the bottom line. The bottom line is we are still dealing with the vestiges of colonialism. Christine is absolutely right. Let me make it very clear what I'm talking about. In colonialistic America, men talk to other men about the role of women. In colonialistic America, whites talk to other whites about the role of people of color. You talk to somebody with this color skin, and we will tell you we deal with that in one form or another every day. That is the context of the George Floyd murder. Christine is absolutely right. That didn't happen 2 months ago. This has been like a teapot on the back eye of a stove that's been simmering for hundreds and hundreds of years. And until we realize the one fundamental truth, I don't think we will get it. And the fundamental truth, I think, is that if we expect to see transformation out there, it has to begin in here. And I'll be very honest with you, Eli, the only way that kind of transformation can occur is when we are faced to deal with racism up close and personally, when it invades our home, our family, and our space. Otherwise, it's your issue and it's their issue. And what happens is we start saying, oh, it's a police issue, it's a white issue, it's a Black issue, it's a brown issue. All of those play a part. But my friend, this is a human issue that transcends every kind of different kind of characteristic we would want to place upon it. I think probably the good part of what is going on, if there is a good part, is that it's forcing us to face the question, what in the world is going on? And what's going on is we have never addressed this issue. We tried. We have compromises in the 13th Amendment, but guess what? Fred Shuttlesworth was right, that lieutenant with Martin King. Just because something becomes law doesn't mean that people follow the law. Ball teams don't strike themselves out. Rattlesnakes don't commit suicide. We tried with the 14th Amendment, but then we had Plessy versus Ferguson, which literally stamped institutional racism on this country. It literally nullified the 13th Amendment. We tried. We had the 15th Amendment that guaranteed the right to vote, and then women had to march for a suffrage movement. And so we've never had a sustained conversation that really went to the extreme of saying there's got to be some heart transfusion, some heart transformation that has to occur with me as a leader, that then has to be voiced, verbalized, and modeled throughout the organization.
Excellent. Thank you. Myrtle?
Well, I think that so much of what I see and I feel is this whole need to have to conform. And Black people in this country, we've had to conform just to survive. And so when we come into the workplace, whether it be a corporation or an institution of higher learning, we're working so hard to conform that we don't even we don't feel free to speak out about the inequities that we feel, the fears that we feel, our frustration. So that silence becomes something that I think has become viewed as, well, everything is okay. You know, we're not talking about it. When a Black man is murdered by the police in America before George Floyd, I would suck it up and come to work the next day, and it would never be mentioned. You know, you would see another Black person in the coffee room or the break room, And you kind of give this nod of, it happened again, but there's no conversation about it. These things weren't spoken of. That silence has led people to say, well, there is no racism. I don't see it here, or I don't see color. And I say to that, you can't, until you see me, you cannot afford to not see color. But we as Black people, our silence is deafening and is killing us. And the fact that that silence is in the workplace and in all the institutions that we participate in, that silence is also killing us and hurting our society in ways that just can't be measured. So that's what I've been feeling, in this moment, is this need to be more vocal and an acceptance and an interest in what I have to say. And that right there is something that we got to keep at that, because that's transformative. The silence is killing us.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Jones, may I make a comment on what Myrtle just said? Mm-hmm. And I'm in complete, total agreement. Let me couch this comment in an awakening moment for me. And it piggybacks with what both Christine and Myrtle said. And it really underscores that if it doesn't affect you personally, I'll be silent. And this is very embarrassing to share, but maybe it'll help somebody. Yeah. I would go to Washington Redskins games. I would go to Cleveland Indians games. I would do the tomahawk chop. What's the big deal? See, it didn't affect me personally. Not until I heard a Native American say, when you use those names, it's like calling a brown person the N-word. Oh, baby. Now I'm starting to get a completely different perspective because I'm forced to deal with it. We have made it very convenient in America not to be forced to deal with anything, and so we divert to silence.
Yeah, and I think along those lines, one of the things that we have to be very careful about, whether we're talking about higher education settings or talking about in the business world or with organizations, a lot of times we are very eager, and don't mishear me, it's important. We are eager to throw resources at a problem or solving a problem. If we can just get more scholarships for students, if we can just get more money to do this or to solve this and whatever, it helps. But you cannot throw money at an issue, and exactly what Rick and what Virgil is saying, and not look inwardly at your organization or the institution and try to understand how people are experiencing on a day-to-day basis, when they come to work, when they come to our campuses, and encounter a lot of the things that we just illuminated.
That's right. And one of those is inclusion, right? Just kind of building on what we're saying. So we might be able to attract people who are underrepresented minorities, but once they're there in our organizations, how do we include them? Are their voices heard, right? I've looked at it from a business perspective. There are lots of cases out there showing that diversity, equity, and inclusion are all important from a business standpoint, right? Because that diversity and inclusion can actually inspire innovation. We've looked at those cases in business. Then there's this whole social justice piece, and that is what is right socially. Now, let me ask you this. I don't have this question, but it just occurred to me as you were talking, and that is, are you sensing any changes now with what happened since George Floyd's murder, or people are becoming more vocal now? They're extremes. We don't embrace the extremes either, right? But are you sensing any fundamental changes coming from George Floyd's murder?
I think through my lens, I think it's too early to tell. I think what I see happening is what I would call a lot more empathy. People are talking more, but what is interesting for me is what remains to be seen is, whether those dialogues or empathetic conversations will actually turn into action. Mm-hmm. Because at the end of the day, I think what people are looking for, and it's what Rick just articulated earlier too, is, so what is change going to look like, Eli? I mean, for some people, are we talking about changes in our policies in our organizations? Are we talking about changes in our practices, in our processes. You know, those are the harder things that I think organizations, largely defined institutions, and also businesses and companies have to come to terms with. You know, it's not just talk, you know, and having conversations, oh, we need to do something, but what does change look like?
Yeah, that's fair. That's fair. Myrtle, you were going to say something?
I have had more conversations about race and social justice in the workplace in the past 3 months than I have had in my over 30-year career. So that right there is already a huge change. On a personal level, just the way it has impacted me, I have mustered up the courage to deal with my own trauma and initiate those conversations and to participate in those conversations in a way that I've never felt, you know, emboldened to do before. Because like Rick said, sometimes when something's not really affecting you, you conform and you kind of go along. It's not something that I'm proud of, but it's true. You know, it's like everything's going well for me over here. I'm taking care of me and I'm taking care of my family, but what about the greater community? And so I felt more moved to action. I think that all of the statements that companies have put out, those are just great. But like Christine said, what I'm really interested in and what I'm afraid of is what comes after. How do we sustain the momentum that we have to implement long-lasting, finally making a change? That work has to continue. What do we do? What are we doing to make sure that work continues? And are we going to be able to step outside of our own bubble and ensure that we keep that work going?
Yeah. You know, Rick being a communication expert, as you know, part of it is really listening carefully, but the ability to speak out on issues. If we really want to advance, if we want to do better, you've got to feel free to speak out. And are you seeing that change too now, Rick?
Small steps. And Christine's right, it's too early to tell, but you are seeing small steps. And the small steps I'm seeing are from CEOs who would never want to talk to me about this, who are now basically saying, help, my house is on fire, right? And so, I think you have to speak out. I think that a crisis doesn't reveal or make a leader. A crisis reveals the need for leadership. And so that leader has to speak with perspective, has to act with perspective, has to speak with clarity, messaging all the way through with consistency, and also has to model hope. You know, I really believe that I'm dealing with two CEOs of major multinational corporations that are really huge players. And their CEOs are coming to me and they're saying, help me find some diversity candidates. Listen, this has been my, and I would love to defer to Myrtle and to Christine, but this has been my advice. That's the wrong approach. The bottom line is rarely the top priority. And you're focusing on outcome orientations where diversity is a process-based orientation. And so I've been telling them that my understanding is successful companies don't select diversity candidates. Successful organizations develop cultures of diversity. And that is a real, think about this. I'm a baseball fan. If all I saw was the baseball team on the field and I based everything based on what I saw, I would miss 90%. If all you see is what you see, you don't see all there is that needs to be seen. I need every subset broken down to ask, how is diversity messaging happening in the farm system, in the draft system? How's it happening in the instructional league? How are you folks dealing with change and inclusion in the minor leagues? And that's what you don't see. I see a lot of folks that give a great talk, lovely room service with regard to diversity, but if you really want to see diversity, I would tell any CEO or decision maker listening to really subscribe to the theory of the aggregation of marginal gain. That's that Sir Dave Brailsford that you and I have talked about.
Oh, that's right.
The British cycling team was horrific prior to 2003. And so this was his approach. He literally deconstructed every component of British cycling and said, what if we improve by 1% in every component? That's called process orientation, as opposed to, let me just hire her because she looks the part. Let me just hire him. You know what I'm realizing? I've only been dealing with companies for 25, 30 years, but this is what I'm realizing. You don't hire a leader, you develop a leader. Mm-hmm. And what develops the leader is the culture. And the culture is only as strong as people saying, there are practices we have to put in place that inextricably connect the mission of diversity and inclusion to our corporate mission.
That's right.
You don't see that.
Yeah.
You don't see it enough.
Enough. Yeah. Are there any organizations that come to mind where you can say, you know what, this organization is doing it very, very well?
BET. That's a joke.
No, but I want to go back to something that Rick and Myrtle said, because I think it needs some underscoring here, and that is this whole notion of thinking about looking at the hiring, but you've got to look at the organizational culture. Joseph Simplicio wrote an article several years ago, and I wrote an op-ed based on it in 2016 for Insight into Diversity that some of you may want to read. But look at the organizational culture, and I think that leaders of companies, leaders of institutions as well, can also benefit from this. Is you've got to start with who's heading the organization. I tell my graduate students all the time. Last semester, I taught a graduate course on diversity and social justice in higher ed. And one of my students said, well-meaning, said, Dr. Stanley, how do we fix what's going on in our society and our world? And I said, it starts here. It starts with you. Right. Until we look inwardly and until we educate ourselves about racism in America and what it means. Until we educate, for those of us that are members of the dominant group who identify as European American or white, understanding whiteness and what it means in America and the privilege that comes with being white in America, as Rick was alluding to, and what that means for leadership and how we lead institutions, how we lead our companies, and understand the culture of your companies and how you work to build that organizational culture. I mean, a lot of us will be hard pressed to deny that they don't value diversity as a mission of our organization, right? Who's gonna deny that? We care about it, but where the misalignment occurs is our artifacts and what we espouse do not align. They're not aligned. They're not aligned.
I think it's also about accountability and saying that, this institution has been a white institution for, hundreds of years, and we have accountability and ownership for diversity and inclusion. We are the ones that are in power, and we are empowered to make a change. And when I say accountability, it's about the conversations, it's about the tone for the top, it's about the policies and procedures that you put in place to make it happen. When we look at what's happened with women diversity in America, it's because men decided that they were going to be held accountable for making that diversity happen. They didn't just say we value it, we want it. They set matrices. They made themselves accountable. People's bonuses depended upon it. Their ability to be promoted depended upon it. So there are tools that all companies, all institutions have that they can use to make this happen, but they have to hold themselves accountable for making that happen. So I feel like that's something, that's where this has to go. It has to be, again, yes, aligning that with the vision, with the values, but also with how people get paid and how they get promoted.
And I think along with that too, Kimberly Crenshaw, who's a law professor, wrote for the University of Michigan Law Review in 2006. And it reminded me of something of what you just said, Myrtle. You know, when we look at the success with enhancing women, the primary beneficiaries of affirmative action have been what? White women.
White women, yes.
White women.
We've got some slides we'd like to share with you, just building off of this conversation. And so we're going to put up some slides for you to think about. You know, when we talk about really making major changes, here's some statistics for you to think about. You know, look at the Fortune 500 companies and the CEOs of these companies. What we're showing here is 9% of Fortune 500 companies have a minority in the CEO position. 9%. If you look at it from the C-suite perspective, 16% of the C-suite positions in the Fortune 100 are held by minorities. You know, if we're going to make some substantive changes, we ought to see some changes at the top in terms of leadership. Would you agree with that? Any comments? Let's move to the next slide. We have 3. When you think about changes that have been made, right? So we have the position that was created, Chief Diversity Officer. All right, and so that is something that has been implemented. And then based on our research, 60% of the Fortune 500 has a Chief Diversity Officer position. We at Texas A&M, we have a Chief Diversity Officer. Here in Mays Business School, we have a Chief Diversity Officer. So that is something that has changed. But we're talking about more holistic changes, right? Let's look at this next slide. If you look at board membership, what percentage of Fortune 100 board seats are held by minorities? Now that's when you're really making some changes to organizations, when you think about CEO positions and board membership. 984 out of 1,222 board seats in the Fortune 100 are held by white men. You know, you mentioned women. We're starting to see more women drawn to boards. And by the way, you know, there are proxy advisory services where they rate the stock better if you have more women on the board, right? And so we're starting to see those kinds of changes. But look at this, just kind of zooming out a little bit. Of the newly appointed board members to the Fortune 500 in 2010, all the way through 2018, 81% white. When are we going to start seeing board membership changing, board composition changing? Now, I want to speak to both Myrtle and Christine here. Thank you for those slides. And I want to build off of this concept of when are we going to start seeing these changes at the top? And in particular, what we're starting to see is more boards recruiting women. So there is some progress there. But what have we learned that could help other underrepresented minorities? Anything there?
I believe that I'll go back to what I just said. It's about 2 things. One is the number of allies that, you know, white women have been able to amass around them that are willing to go out and fight for them and put them in these positions. They just have a lot more allies amongst the people that have the power to put you in those positions. One of the other things that stands in the way of advancement of a lot of Blacks in America is just the network. I mean, people like to hire people that they feel comfortable with, you know, and they go, and it's a lot easier to see yourself, you know, hanging out at the golf course or whatever it is with someone whose background is similar to yours. So people have to be willing to push themselves outside of those comfort zones. They have to be willing to admit their own unconscious biases, to see past a person's ethnic background and what have you in order to just get to the bottom of the talent. You cannot just say that you don't have these unconscious biases, and you've got to be willing to confront those things in order for you to start bringing more, you know, more people of color into these positions. A lot of work has been done on women. I mean, there are so many conferences every year. There are consultants that specialize in it, but the type of emphasis and the type of work that has gone into that for some reason has just not happened with Black people. It just hasn't. But that has to happen. That same energy has got to come to this cause as it went to the women's cause. There's not going to happen.
Yeah. That allyship, that's a great point, Myrtle. Very, very good. Good point. More allyship.
Yes.
So I think, Myrtle, you made a very good point earlier, and I want to get back to it. And this is a whole notion about accountability, and I think, having sat in a position of a senior diversity officer for Texas A&M for 8.5 years, one of the things is, when I took the position in 2009, one of the things that I made it very clear to the president then is, and this became a philosophy of how I led on campus, and that is, this is essentially what I said, almost word for word. I said, if you think one person in this role is going to change Texas A&M University, it's not going to happen. This is everyone's responsibility. And that's how I led, including working and building relationships with the deans of the academic colleges, with the other vice presidents and members of the leadership team. So, it can't just be the senior diversity officer. Even that person is occupying that space, obviously, and you need someone in that position. Don't mishear me, but it's got to be the imperative for the whole organization. And this whole notion about hiring, the research studies are clear that implicit bias and assumptions affect how we evaluate and how we hire candidates for positions. And there's also name bias in recruitment. Applicants, for example, with white sounding names having an unfair advantage when looking for jobs. So those are some of the things that I think we have to pay very, very careful attention to.
And this is just an observation. I don't have a question. I don't have an answer to it. But it seems that it's so easy to see a Black person in a senior executive position as a diversity officer,
Right.
but not as a CFO.
Right. It's true. And it showed in our statistics just a second ago. You're absolutely right, Myrtle.
Yeah, they believe that we're very, very
That's right.
capable of handling that position.
Right.
But you get to,
So you almost get typecast. You almost get typecast in that role, right?
Share a quick story that happened on campus several years ago. When I was in upper administration, I was invited by a colleague to do a presentation with our international board at Texas A&M. And these are Aggies, from all over the world who convene, I believe, once or twice a year on campus. So I was doing a presentation. At the end, there was Q&A. We were in Rudder Tower at the time. And a gentleman, I can't remember his name, he said to me, he said, Dr. Stanley, could you give us some advice about what we could do as an international board? So I was talking, and then this gentleman, was from Europe, and he just said in front of his colleagues on the board, he said, you know what, folks, look around this boardroom. Tell me, what do you see in here? And there was stunned silence. And then he said, we have a problem here with our own board. We're all white. Look at us. We've got a problem. And I just sat there and I just listened to the conversation. It was a beautiful conversation, dialogue that ensued afterwards. But again, as Rick said earlier, it's the culture of how you build that and looking inwardly of what you need to do.
Speaking of what you need to do, there are senior leaders of major organizations listening to this webcast. What is the one significant action a leader can take over the next year to make the most tangible impact in the area of diversity, equity, and inclusion? If you had to advise these leaders who are listening in, what's the one thing? Just to get us started.
May I just begin by saying something very simple? I would love to have dinner or lunch, Miss CEO or Mr. CEO, with your head of diversity or whatever role that particular person of color plays. But just as important, I would like to look at your mission statement and see if equity issues align with your mission statement. You see, anybody can offer the facade of change. But if we really are serious about wanting systemic change, it has to occur at every single level within the infrastructure of the organization, above and beyond just a polite, casual nod. One of the problems with systemic racism over the years is that we've treated it as sort of a separate and discrete kind of anecdotal sort of thing. It's over there. It doesn't affect me here. And so we will tend to allow comments in the workplace like, I'm not racist. Oh, I'm good. I'm okay. And I think that, be very honest with you, I think it was Christine who said, it might have been Myrtle, but I think we're all in the same vibe here. Until it really affects you and you're willing to take ownership. I hope this is reminding the people that are listening of the fact that I happen to be a man of color and I had to take ownership of participating in something that was offensive to Native Americans. Until it affects you to the point that you're willing to take ownership, it will always be a thing over there. It will always be a separate and discrete problem over there. I always found it interesting when I was a kid growing up in the 60s that in most African American homes, there was a picture of Jesus. That was good. There was a picture of Martin King. That was good. And I thought at the time, it was good that there was a picture of John Kennedy. It wasn't until I was in my PhD program that I realized that Kennedy did not care about the civil rights movement. He called it, quote, a political football, end quote. He pushed it over there to that attorney general named Robert Kennedy, right? As a matter of fact, sadly, had Kennedy not been assassinated, we would have had a very watered down Public Accommodations Act of 1964. I think that's common knowledge. What's the point? The point isn't to badmouth Kennedy. The point is that it is human behavior to treat something that isn't affecting us directly as something that we can relocate over there. And I think that's the real issue.
Yeah.
I would want people to grab on.
I agree with you. I reflect on my undergraduate years at Prairie View A&M University, my graduate years at Texas A&M. Some of you heard me talk about Ben Welch. Ben and I were in graduate school together, and we shared the same dissertation advisor. We were in the same office, and I remember, sometimes Ben and I, who identifies as a white male, he and I would be having conversations about race issues and about other stuff. We talked about our families, how we grew up, and sometimes we had some difficult dialogues about how we saw the world, from each of our lenses. But I tell you what, the friendship that has occurred, from both of us, from both our spheres of influence, it's stronger because of that. And it's exactly what you're talking about, Rick. Until we really own it, and we listen to each other, on our own perspectives and our own life experiences.
Yeah. Christine, you make a very good point. And as you were talking, I was thinking to myself, I love Ben. And I was thinking to myself, the key with you and Ben is I bet you kept talking. And see, that's what we're not talking to each other. See, I don't think we have to, in this society of ours, we don't have to think alike, but we do need to think together. I told Eli, to the other panel members and to those who are listening, that I was asked to be on Charles Payne's show, Making Money. It's one of those Fox shows. And it was December the 18th. And here was the setup. Charles Payne got a conservative and a liberal around a kitchen table, as it were. And they were to pretend as though it's Christmas dinner, and here was the setup. How do we talk to each other without killing each other? And I'm called in to offer a communicative paradigm, which basically went like this. Are you nuts? Are you kidding? Have we got to the point that we don't show civility, that we don't have respect for each other, that we don't listen to each other? And I remember in my little neighborhood, in the hood, in the San Francisco Bay Area, on the front porch, there would be tremendous debate between my parents and anybody else that happened to stop by. But at the end of the hour, they got up, shook hands, probably learned from each other. We're not listening to each other, Eli. It's far more important to advance our agenda. Well, our company isn't racist, or look what we're doing. We have the head of whatever, as opposed to I've got equity issues that I constantly need to put before my people that should transcend every single artificial boundary or real boundary that we have in this company. And until I satisfy those equity issues, I have a long way before I get to the finish line.
Yeah.
It is about owning it, and it's about not putting a Band-Aid on this in this moment to be able to send out that press release to say that we did these things and it's all good now. Let's all go back to business as usual. Let's not do that.
That's right.
We
That's
gotta
right.
make a commitment to making this, as you said, a change in the culture.
Yes.
And that takes time. And we have to be patient with each other. We've got to be able to have these difficult conversations. We have to be able to say what we need to say, ask the questions that we need to ask from a place of empathy and concern and understanding and of love. And we can have those conversations, and we can say some things that maybe don't always come out the right way. But if we know that those statements are coming from the right place, we understand and we move on, and we really solve this thing once and for all.
Yeah, I think, we have to be willing to suspend judgment and
Yes.
to engage in perspective taking, and I'm going to brag on the Mays Business School here a little bit, and in particular, Eli and Jerry Strausser. Eli doesn't know this, so he's going to know this for the first time right now. Oops. It's all good, Eli. Don't worry.
Okay.
Several years ago, when Texas A&M was engaging in a national search to find the dean who was going to succeed Jerry Strausser, right? The chair of the search committee called me at the time, and I was in my senior diversity officer role, and essentially said to me, and I was just like, I was heartened, because this is what he said to me on the phone. Christine, I've been asked by the provost back then to chair this search to find the next dean for Mays Business School. I want you to help me. How can I build a culture within the search committee and within, get this, the search firm that we have engaged to make sure that we build a diverse pool of candidates to be the next dean for Texas A&M. And to me, that spoke volumes. Another example, when Jerry Strausser, former dean of Mays, became our chief financial officer for Texas A&M. And again, this is culture building. Mm-hmm. Jerry called me and says, how can I engage my leadership team about talking about some of these issues? Because the work that we're doing for Texas A&M and what you're asking us to do, Christine, this is going to take time. Exactly what Myrtle just said. Right. And another example is Eli knows her. She just stepped off as serving dean for our College of Veterinary Medicine and Biomedical Sciences at A&M. Eleanor Green stood up in front of her colleagues at a national meeting in DC and said in front of hundreds of veterinarians, said, look, if we're serious about diversity and inclusion, it's not going to change overnight, but I tell you what, we have been known historically as a white profession, and things are not going to change if we continue to be a white profession. And there was just this silence in the auditorium.
Yeah, right. So I'm hearing own it, build in some accountability metrics that will help sustain it, right? I'm hearing a lot about the kind of culture that you build, and this is really the essence of what we're talking about in terms of making substantive changes in these organizations. Yeah, good. Well, I know we're starting to get questions from the audience, and so we're going to take a few questions from the audience. Give me one of those, right? Yeah, there you go. So thank you, audience, for hanging in there with us. I think this is really, really good. So here's one. What does a 50-year-old private family corporation do to foster inclusion? A 50-year-old private family corporation do to foster inclusion? So,
I think that they do what anyone else does. They, first of all, they make a commitment to it. Uh, Obviously, if you're a privately held corporation, you know, you're family owned, you've got to be willing to open up your network. If you don't have jobs, you open up your supplier network. If you don't have the supplier network, you go out in the community and you start making an investment, you know, in the community and in the education of people of color and underrepresented populations so that you build. If you can't do it within your company, then you recognize your role of making social change in the community that you benefit from. You know, corporations, businesses, they have an obligation to the communities in which they operate and that they thrive in, is to get back to those communities. And by making those partnerships and being very visible in those partnerships, again, whether it be with vendors, maybe whether it be with community partners, they start to look, not just look more inclusive, they start to feel more inclusive and they become more inclusive. So you find a place where you can operate, where you can start making a difference, where you can start building those relationships for that inclusive environment, and you go from there.
right. Public or private, doesn't matter. Some of the things that we talked about still apply.
Yes.
Eli, you said family owned, right?
Family owned.
So, in addition to what Myrtle just shared, which I so appreciated hearing, this is a challenging question on a number of levels.
Yep.
I just talked to a very similar company, very profitable, no people of color, no women on the executive, on the C level, right? The patriarch is in his 80s. And how do I say this charitably? Change is a challenge.
Yes.
And I think the question is a good one because now you are dealing with stakeholders that see change, but for various reasons are scared to discuss it because their actual livelihood and their stake in the company can be at stake. I think it requires younger stakeholders to
Yes.
go to the older stakeholders and say, here is an agenda that goes beyond gender and that goes beyond race. A classic example is Martin King and his ability to get Jews and Gentiles and Protestants and Catholics and whites and browns and blacks to not point to a black person being free, but a beloved community.
Yes.
That was the moral imperative. He said on one occasion, either we're going to learn to live together as brothers and sisters or we're going to perish together as fools. I think it might require some younger family members. I met some of them at this engagement to gingerly but in a straightforward way talk to those older patriarch family members and say, our compass needs to be for that which is right. Our compass needs to go beyond the parameters of race and gender and embrace the human issues in life. And in embracing the human issues in life, we will see the diversity that we seek. But whoever asks that question, my heart goes out because you're talking about family.
It's difficult.
It's a challenge. It is a challenge. But I think I would love to hear what Christine and Myrtle have to say. I think in my limited experience, those younger stakeholders have to step up and have the courage to say, even though everything is at stake, Papa, Grandpapa, Grandmama, we need to have a talk for what is good for all people, not just some people.
No, I think, and I think that's the key. You know, talk about difficult dialogues. I had a difficult dialogue with, and this was years ago, when I was growing up in Jamaica. The patriarch of our family was my grandfather, well respected in our community, passed away at 95. And my grandfather was this person, you know, who was very strict, very steadfast in the way he thought about things, had a particular mental model in terms of how we view the world and how things ought to be, and it was difficult to get him to, to think differently, exactly what you just said, and the key thing is, and you're right on point, is the younger folks. And at that time, of the grandkids, it was said in the family that supposedly I was one of his favorites, but I remember having a conversation with him, and I said, Papa, what you did last week, you got to think about this, in terms of how this affects X, Y, and Z and whatever. And I had a long conversation with my grandfather. I mean, at the time when I had this conversation, he was 82 years old.
Wow.
Yes. And then he came back to me and he said to me, he said, I've been thinking about what you said to me, and you're right. It's time for a change.
That's good. Very good. And by the way, in the Center for Executive Development, we actually can come in and customize some programs for you, for those of you who are listening. And we do this for Myrtle's company already. We do customized leadership development. In fact, we have a team of people who can help facilitate having these difficult conversations. So I wanted to throw that out. So it actually leads me to the next question. That is, when we think about higher education, typically people think about our undergraduate population, but we have graduate students. At Mays, we have an executive MBA program. We have a professional MBA program. And as I mentioned, the Center for Executive Development. What could we do in higher ed to help lead and inspire these changes?
So one of the things that I think makes a difference is, and you talked about change earlier, Eli, and I've seen a little bit of change for the example I'm going to share right now. So for the first time in my home department in the College of Education and Human Development, we're in the higher ed research program. We decided among the faculty that we were going to make the diversity and social justice course in higher ed a required course for all our PhD graduates and our master's graduates, right? And the change that I'm seeing is our students are coming to these conversations with their hearts and minds open and are asking, really thoughtful questions about how what they're learning in class is going to impact their what they're doing in the workforce. Some aspire to work in the higher education setting. Some aspire to work in companies and organizations in roles like Myrtle. So that's the kind of change that I'm seeing. I don't know if there's something similar in Mays, but I would argue, that I think that across all academic fields, I think we ought to think more carefully about some of the courses that we offer around this particular issue, because it affects all that we're doing in the world. I mean, for example, how can, and I'm thinking about Mays and what I know of Mays. How can you be an accountant or be in marketing or be in finance or, talk about other areas, and diversity and inclusion does not impact what you're doing in those lines if you're working for a company. For me, I see it,
Right.
So Soren Sorescu, who
Finance
I've had these conversations as department head of, I think you said Department of Finance. I love Soren. We have these deep conversations about these issues. How can it not affect the work that you're doing? So that's what I would have to offer.
Good.
I mean, ultimately, if you are a business major, ultimately, most of you are going to have a goal of one day, being a leader, being a manager. So to me, that should be a very important aspect of your management classes, is how to manage a diverse workforce, how to attract and engage, a diverse workforce. So that to me seems like that would be something that you should aspire to incorporating in your curriculum. We to make sure that we have that skill set in place when people start aspiring to those positions. And what I seen, when I was going through school, is that you would have Black history classes and you would have, women's studies classes. And guess who went to Black history classes? Black people. Guess who went to the women's studies classes? Women. That's not really helping,
Right. Yeah. That's good. That's great. Well, in our strategic plan, we have these mindsets. And so when we think about these mindsets lead us to really engage our students in the thought of becoming a transformational leader. So we have transformational leadership programs, and at every level of our education, we really try to get our students to understand the inclusive mindset, the mindset of really taking all of the things that we're talking about, all of these various topics. But what's overarching would be that the mindset change is what we're working on. So this is really good.
Absolutely, because Eli, all of us, Myrtle, and Rick, the truth of the matter is, we're preparing. I tell my students, I said, look, we're preparing you for the brave new world out there.
Yes. Right.
You're going to be working for companies like Halliburton, or HEB or IBM or whatever. You could be stationed in Korea, in South Africa, in Canada, all over the world, so you have got to work with and solve major problems, with other people who don't look like you and certainly don't think like you, or probably never had the same life experiences like you.
That's
right.
That's right.
But we all know, that's what makes companies better and robust.
Yes. Christine, you said something earlier too that I latched onto, and that is, to what extent do we incorporate this thinking into our PhD program as well? So we're educating the next generation of professors, right? And so they would learn this mindset change, and they would carry the flag, if you will, to the next institution. So that's another really good idea. That's great. Let's see, we have another question here. What are some of the most innovative solutions that you've seen companies embrace to advance diversity and inclusion acceptance? We're talking about acceptance. I know we talked about the culture, but what are some of the ways they've been able to do that in your experience?
Well, I feel like the spotlight is on me because I'm the one that's in a corporation. But I'll just be honest. I think that we are really just now in this moment looking for innovative ways. I think that there's been a playbook out there that people have followed, and now we are going to have to realize that that playbook needs to be expanded. It's just not enough. Like Christine said, it is not enough to have a diversity and inclusion officer. I would say that if what she was saying about how she has made it her mission that she's not the only one that's responsible for diversity and inclusion, it's everyone in the organization that's responsible for it. Now, that I would have to say that it sounds simple and it shouldn't be innovative, but it really is. And I feel like organizations that have been successful with, incorporating more women, it has been because they've said it's not just the role of the diversity officer, it's every person in this organization is going to take ownership of that. We have that at Halliburton for sure, that, line managers all the way down the line have been made responsible, for hiring and retaining, more women. So is that innovative? It shouldn't be, but I kind of think it is.
Eli, I have a answer to the question that came in. Failure, and let me explain. I'm coaching a company that the CEO and the executive vice presidents, all good people, well-intentioned people, actually thought that the change would occur, as Myrtle said, if we just hire a director of diversity and inclusion. And when that failed, it forced them to realize something else has to move employee engagement. They come up with this employee engagement committee on which I serve. Here's our main task, and it's just so simple, it's ridiculous. We need to, first of all, identify invisible barriers. And then we need to set about how to knock those invisible barriers down. You know, it's interesting. I was good friends with a dean when I was at Texas A&M who happened to be a person of color. And he would tell me on a weekly basis, I fight two battles: the battle across my desk and the invisible battle. And people of color and women, I think, get that. Maybe whites also get that, but we profoundly get that. I think that the failure of this particular company with thinking that a hire is going to solve something when it didn't even put a Band-Aid on it forced the development of an employee engagement organization that would still try to move the needle. You can judge their motive if you want, but what our number one focus is looking through the 1,500 employees of this company and looking through the subsections and looking through the messaging and looking through the policies and asking, are equity issues anywhere being promoted, implemented, and modeled? And what we're finding is that there are 13 to 3,100 invisible barriers. Mm-hmm. And the first part is to really identify them, that they exist, that they're not just in the heads of a black man or a Hispanic man or a white woman. They are there, whether we want to believe it or not. So I think that through failure came acknowledgement. And now hopefully that will lead to the breaking down of some of those barriers.
I also think, going back to, what was shared earlier, and I think may have been Rick or you, Myrtle, that says this, about, understanding self, and where yourself is situated within these issues. And I'll tell you why I say that. I remember when I was being heavily recruited from Ohio State to come back to Texas A&M, by a former dean who's now moved on to a presidency. My former department head, who's now retired, he came and sat in my office one day, and this is what he said to me. Some of you may know him. Brian Cole identifies as a white male. Brian sat in my office, and I was an assistant professor on tenure at the time. And he said to me, and it was so empowering. This is what he said, and it made me think that he was thinking about this from my own lens. And he sat in my office and he said, Christine, you have so many talents, and so many things going on, whatever. You are going to be drawn in so many different directions. But I want you to know, as your department head, okay, your job here, and he outlined it, whatever, is to do this, and you do this, you be successful at getting tenure. I want you to feel free. Anybody that comes to you and is luring you away to do things that you don't feel comfortable doing or whatever, feel free to tell them, that your department head said this. And my former thesis advisor, again, white male who retired from the Air Force, said this to me. I don't know what it's like to be a black woman on a white campus, but I will tell you, as a white man, I'm here to support you, and I don't ever want to see you walking around the campus like you don't belong here. Mm. That empowered me.
That's good. That's good.
And we need that empowerment. Some of the things that have been so important to me is when I've had a boss say to me, Myrtle, go do what you need to do. I'm going to give you cover. Mm. There was a situation where I felt vulnerable. I felt vulnerable about my position. There were things that were going on that I won't be specific about, but I felt very vulnerable. I thought about me being a black woman. Would I be the one that would survive this particular situation? And my boss called me in and he said to me, Myrtle, I see you seem stressed, you're not maintaining your emotional intelligence the way I'm accustomed to seeing you do so. And I think that you're worried, but here's what you need to understand. Myrtle, you're our girl. You're my girl. Yeah. You're the CEO's girl. You're the board's girl. Relax. go do your job.
Mhm.
And the fact that he recognized that I needed that assurance
Yes.
was so powerful in the comfort it gave me to just go back and get back to doing my job and being able to go home at night and sleep and not worry that even though I felt like, hey, I'm the best person for this job, I know I am, but I may be edged out, for a white male. The fact that he was able to see that and that he gave me that cover, it meant the world to me, and not just now as I think back about it, but just in my day to day, like I said, the fact that I could get up, that I could go home at night and go to sleep, and I can get up the next day and go about my daily routine and not have that stress on me. It's so important, and we need that empathy, we need that nurturing, we need the organization to recognize that we're going to feel vulnerable in certain situations, and we may need more of that nurturing, more of that sponsorship, more of that mentorship if we want the underrepresented populations to be able to feel the comfort that they need to perform at the level that they are truly capable of.
Yes.
They need to feel that support.
I think you're right, because I think, if I had one thing to say to leaders of companies, primarily those, that are heading companies who are members of the dominant group that identify as white. One thing that I think you need to understand is that people of color for centuries, have been placed in the role of expending a lot of emotional, physical, and invisible labor of educating and teaching others about racism.
Yeah.
What we're talking about today.
Yeah.
And I cannot say that enough. There's a lot of emotional, physical, and invisible labor around this work.
Yeah.
That's right. Absolutely agree. Well, folks, we're starting to wind down now, and I just want to thank you again for everything that you've done. I think these are very important lessons, and I just want to give you a moment to provide some closing comments. Thinking about our audience, again, senior level executives, higher educational senior leaders, what is your closing argument? Let's start with Myrtle.
Well, first of all, I want to just say, thank you for being here and for showing up for this conversation and for listening and for actively listening. And I just want to encourage you to keep listening. And when we're not volunteering to come to you with these discussions, reach out to us and ask. There is a lot of labor to it. As Christine said, there's a lot of labor. There's a lot of physical labor. There's a lot of mental labor to having these conversations. It's draining at times, but it's too important to stop talking. So my closing words are, please, let's keep the conversations up and continue to be engaged.
Excellent. Thank you. Christine, closing statement.
Closing statement, I'm going to leave you all with a quote from one of my favorite authors, Maya Angelou. And one of the things that Maya Angelou said, which speaks to our conversation today about making the change, is to remember this. Prejudice is a burden that confuses the past, threatens the future, and renders the present inaccessible.
Thank you. Thank you. Excellent. Rick, closing statement.
My closing statement is one of gratitude to everybody who tuned in. By the mere fact that you made this a part of your day speaks volumes about the kind of person and the kind of leader that you are. I appreciate that. I still have hope. I really do. I have hope that we will move beyond the facade of democracy, beyond the facade and the window dressing of inclusion and diversity. And I think that a major step is when people will just humble themselves and listen. And I want to say thank you for humbling yourself and for listening. I know that sometimes you may not have agreed. That's okay. Sometimes it might have been awkward. That's okay. But as I tried to share with my students at A&M, dissension is not a bad thing. Dissension moves forward citizenship. We learn and we grow together. And so I close with the words of the wisest man I ever met in my life, my dad, a third grade dropout. He's been gone for 25 years, but he still speaks to his son. And right after the George Floyd murder, I said, Daddy, talk to me. And he just simply said that I heard in my heart, son, before you can expect change out there, there needs to be change in here. And thank you all for listening to us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
all. Thank you. We really appreciate it. I want to thank the Center for Executive Development for putting this together for us. So Greg Markey, our Assistant Dean, I want to thank you. I want to thank Brandy. I want to thank Ben Welch. I want to thank Amy. I want to thank our cameraman who's been working hard behind the scenes, and certainly our audience. Thank you so much for tuning in. We hope that this added value. That was the whole purpose. So let's keep making the change. I believe that we can be united. This is one step toward that. Greg, any closing comments?
Just, Dean Jones, I want to thank you. I want to thank Myrtle, Christine, Rick, and all of those who joined us today for this really powerful and insightful discussion. So relevant during these times and really all the time. How we all approach diversity and inclusion in our organization should not stop with this panel. As Myrtle said, keep the conversations up. There is so much more to do and to learn, and we at Mays Business School are here to help. Tomorrow morning, all of you will receive an email from me providing additional resources and support from the Center for Executive Development. In addition, there will be instructions in the email on how you would be able to access a copy of the video of this panel. Once again, thank you all for participating in this powerful discussion. As Rick said, have hope and have a wonderful week. Thank you all.